afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone who is joining us from NASCA headquarters. We are really excited to have you all here today. We're going to give everyone a couple more minutes. We have several people joining us on the call right now before we kicked off, but I just want to say hello, welcome. Thank you guys so much for being here. We're really excited that you have joined us this afternoon. We're just giving everyone a few more minutes to log in. We've got quite a few people logging in with us today. So, and thank you everyone from the NASCA. We see quite a few names that we recognize on the roster today, and we're just really excited to keep the conversation going with all of our state members today. All right, looks like we still have about 7 more people in the waiting room, so we're going to keep letting those people in. So thank you all, and we'll start right here in about 1 minute, letting the big group in. And if you'll go ahead and rename yourself, you can actually put your mouse over your screen, and there's 3 little buttons that should pop up, and you can actually rename yourself with your state if you want to know who else is on the call, or if you want to kind of share peer-to-peer. That's also helpful for us to know who is on the call. So if you want to do that, that is extremely helpful. So with that, we're at 2 after. We've got quite a big group here today. Thank you guys so much. And I'm going to hand it over to our NASCA Executive Director.
Thank you, Jamie. And I want to also echo my welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is NASCA's Thought Leadership Series. Today we're going to be addressing COVID-19, reopening and reimagining state government operations. We know that states across the country are grappling with whether, how, and when to return to normal service operations, as well as what that next normal should look like. Today's virtual event is going to provide a framework for state governments to consider how to reopen effectively, as well as reimagine the next normal for state government operations in the context of the current global health pandemic. Our presenters will help us understand the key operational challenges currently facing states and discuss approaches to overcome these challenges. They will also introduce a framework state government leaders can use to develop a comprehensive strategy to resume operations and to reimagine the future of state service delivery. Let me pause by first saying it's a generous welcome and offer from McKinsey & Company to support this Thought Leadership Series with NASCA. And thank you, McKinsey, for not only presenting, but supporting our efforts at NASCA. If you're new to NASCA events, I'd like to again thank you for joining us today. NASCA assists state chief administrators and their team strategically transform state government operations through the power of shared knowledge and thought leadership. We know that states oversee a myriad of functions, including general services, procurement, facilities, etc. Our entire team today from NASCA hopes you find that today's information is very insightful and useful to you. A few housekeeping notes before we begin today. We do ask that you mute your cell phones and computer mics to eliminate any outside noise and allow our speakers to proceed without interruption. We would strongly encourage you to use the chat feature to send questions, communicate privately with another attendee, or send a note to the entire group. We will be monitoring the chat for questions for our speakers as we go throughout our time today. I also want you to know that there will be polling as part of today's event. These are anonymous and they'll not be used for any future research. They are informal engagement tools being used today during our Thought Leadership event. I also want you to know that today's event is being recorded. However, it will only be available under a state login for your peers and also state members to view. Any comments in the chat are recorded as a prominent feature of Zoom. However, neither NASCA nor McKinsey will be using these information beyond today's event. And finally, before we get started, the materials from today's event will be posted to NASCA's website following our conversation. Now let me introduce our presenters for today's event. Sarah Tucker-Ray is a partner in McKinsey's Washington, D.C. office. Sarah has worked in the United States across federal, state, and local levels and with national governments globally. She specializes in helping governments better deliver services through customer experience and design approaches and promote economic growth through state strategic investments. Kunal Modi is an associate partner in McKinsey's San Francisco office and a leader in the firm's public sector practice. Kunal's experience includes stewarding digital and operational transformations for public agencies, spearheading regional economic development efforts, and working on financial risk and public finance topics. And our third presenter today is Meg Ekdev. She's an associate in McKinsey's Washington, D.C. office and a member of the firm's digital practice. She focuses on customer centricity, digital transformation, and service delivery, including the public sector. With that, let me turn to Sarah to begin our conversation today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for being with us today. We are looking forward to a lively conversation, we hope. So in addition to the polls, we will have chance for Q&A at the end, but we also really do encourage you to the chat feature. We will be monitoring that and would love your input as we go along. So thank you so much. So I will jump right into this to say, we are all here in the middle of this true humanitarian challenge, and I know that this has got to be keeping each of you up at night and making your team just incredibly busy. And so we first wanted to say thank you for this time with us, and also to please pass along our gratitude to your whole teams for everything you're doing for the public broadly. We know that the delivery of essential services today is challenging. We know that you didn't close. We know that operations are open. We know that workspaces, though, may be in some different level of closure versus opening, and you're starting to think about, as your governors move to reopen your economy, what does that mean for your workspaces as well? So that's what we would love to talk to you about today. So we know that today there is the current challenge in front of us, but that this is then also in the context for actually a broader set of questions you're likely facing. So we have seen some of the resiliency weaknesses in state budgets and state operations across the country. If this is IT systems that have been challenged and changed for years have now become front page news. We now know that backlogs are piling up. If that's everything as simple as getting a new car registration to thinking about the backlog at a DMV, where services have been stopped, it's not as if that demand isn't just being pushed forward. So how will we handle that once we come back online more fully? Resident satisfaction, and in some ways, the public we've seen is much more satisfied with response at the state level and the local level than they are at the federal level. That doesn't mean, though, that things are easy broadly. That folks have had real trouble in getting, whether that's unemployment benefits that they need or engaging with states generally. And so we know that you each are dealing with, how do we continue to earn the public trust, work through this moment, and then plan for what's ahead. We also realize with real humility, we're here toward the end of this fiscal year, and we look ahead to next. The conversations are troubling that we're seeing across the country, from what budget pressure is likely and what this may mean for the year ahead. And also the decisions that you are grappling with are not just you and your team, but are also your interaction with municipalities more broadly in your state. And so with that, is there, though, a moment that is opportunity? And there, cliche to say, okay, is there a way to take advantage of a crisis, or at least to use this moment perhaps to rethink what was the status quo or what we had always been intending to do? I think from our conversations, we hosted a webinar actually with many federal agencies on this topic at the end of last week, and this is a real theme that came through, that there is an opportunity to reset in this moment. We have learned things that we never thought possible about the ability to work virtually, the ability to stay connected virtually. There may be many other things that you each from your teams actually have valued in this time, in addition to the things that have, of course, been incredibly troubling and tough. So how do we learn from that, and how do we carry that forward, actually? I think the last thing I would say here is that the renewed criticality, if anything, this crisis has made visible what the dedicated work that you each do day to day, what that means for all of us. And also that we now see customer expectations and how they want to engage with us. And I would imagine in many of the customers you serve, who may be your fellow agency leaders, what they're expecting too. And how do we all move to be more digital and more enabled to work in a more resilient way going forward? And finally, we may have all learned some new skills through all of this. I know at least I personally have. So next, as we think about reopening itself and imagining the roles also that many of you play in particular, we, from the McKinsey and NASCA survey last year of state chief administrators, we already heard you had strategic plans in place. Your leading priorities were business process redesign and improvement. You also were already thinking about facilities, customer experience, and broader modernization. Now taking all those priorities into this moment about reopening and how time intensive this can be, That's what we hope to talk through some today about how to do that, how to plan for that. In working with one state, we saw you're the largest employer in the state. What does this mean for you? How can you send a clear message about how many employees can continue to work from home to reduce strain on the rest of the economy, especially enablers like childcare, schools, and transit that may not be able to be back up and running just yet? What additional enablements might you need, which creates additional procurement and IT challenges to think about what that support actually is, or to think about procuring PPE, for instance, for your own employees. What does that look like? And then in terms of across work sites, these are also not one size fits all. Perhaps comes to mind the office site, but it's familiar to all of you. In working with one state, we saw the incredible diversity across their portfolio that meant actually the long tail of sites that were special purpose were going to require the most of their attention, even though there were not that many employees at each site. And so control measures and adaptability and thinking about planning in that context. And then finally, how do you work centrally to support departments? And what does that relationship look like in planning, especially if you're operating across different jurisdictions or different counties who may also have their own divergent reopening plans that may be very different from what's set at the state level, given health conditions on the ground. So this coordination, local government, industry, suppliers, is just the beginning, and you are in the middle of that. So we today will share some of our lessons from having worked with a few states on these topics, and also our framework more broadly that we've been using with the private sector for thinking about safeguarding workspaces, and also, very importantly, reimagining the work to come once we can get back to some kind of new normal or next normal. We've seen across tackling the crisis several key dimensions here in terms of what leaders are keeping in mind and are balancing. So there's the economic side of things. There likely is a lot of conversation and communication coming out from the state about what industry leaders should expect and what will be expected of them to be allowed to open and to keep the public safe. The workforce return and reimagination, the way that we will interact, if that's even just the way our desks are set up, is likely to be quite different for a very long time. Public health safeguarding, tracking, testing, getting people comfortable with things like temperature taking at state buildings. Is that something that we will think about for the near term? How do we think about elevators? The minutia there that then ends up becoming actually quite important. And then, of course, what is our decision-making apparatus? What data do we have? How do we plan for the budget we need in the short term and the long term? And finally, what is our support to vulnerable communities, which may be many of our coworkers who may have unique circumstances, family members who are vulnerable, or themselves, and to think how we can care for our teams in this time. So we'd love to ask you a poll question here, and this will help guide a bit of what we share. Where we would want to hear your perspective. What issue is most pressing to address for you in tackling the COVID-19 crisis? We'll put up a couple options on your screen that your answer will not be attributed to you, and then we'll be able to see those aggregated feedback across everybody. Brennan, do you mind launching the poll?
Sorry, doing just this level. I was having a course technical difficulties here.
No problem. I can tell you all as we get this going, the dimensions we were thinking about, and just so you start to think of what you would pick as your answer. The mix, is this economic reopening and recovery? Is this the workforce return and reimagination? Is this real-time decision intelligence and support? And you see this in front of you now. And then budget, vulnerable communities, and public health, of course.
So for the technical difficulty here, I do apologize. I will have to share my screen to apparently do that poll. This is something we did not test. So if you're fine with me switching over for just a minute.
Oh, I have the poll up. I'm actually okay. I think others do too.
Oh, perfect. It's just me. Fantastic.
Well, hopefully we'll give folks a second to submit, and then
we're getting a great
results, and that'll help steer us.
Response to about 30% of people answering the poll right now. So we'll give it a few more seconds before we close that poll. Right, and we're right at a 50%, so if we'll do 10 more seconds, it's your last chance to take the poll.
Great. And I know there was some crackling on the line earlier. Please, folks, if you are having any trouble hearing me, send something in the chat and we'll see what we can do.
All right, great. Christy, do you want to close the poll or do you want me to close it? I'll go ahead and end the poll, and I'm going to share the results.
Thank you. Wow. So, I mean, this in the spirit of workforce and also public health, I imagine are very connected for each of you. So that how do we bring folks back? How do we get them comfortable to come back? How do we think about what it'll mean for them to be safe? And what are the other supports we need? I hear that, and this is a real part of the conversations elsewhere too. And how do you make this happen? Thank you for sharing. So with that, I'll say just a little bit more, and then I'll hand it over to Kunal, who will talk more about some of the practical tools and the framing of how you might start to do some of this planning. Wonderful. So just to tee up the conversation to come, you like your response, there's an immediacy here that we thought was important to share with you, and we imagine this is top of mind. We do know, though, from our conversations with NASCA and what they've been discussing with you all already, it's not as if this planning you haven't started. You have been doing this groundwork laying, and you have had folks who have been at state work sites over time. So we don't mean to start from too basic a place, but we thought it would be helpful at least to share some of the framing and see how some of that planning and thinking, where else we could provide information. But then I think are also very excited about the idea of talking through what's the new normal? What is the reimagination opportunity? What is next from us from this? And what have we learned? And then how also can we plan for the best service delivery we can to our fellow state leaders and to the public at large in a context of a potentially tighter budget environment? And so what are ways to be able to do that effectively? So I'll hand it over to Kunal to talk us through some of that.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to our partners at NASCA for convening this group, and thank you to all of you. I'll reiterate, what Sarah said. We're so appreciative of your extraordinary public service in this time of truly unprecedented global crisis. We know that many of you have been working harder than ever to deliver the essential services that the public relies on, and we're grateful for the work that you do and for spending this time with us as we seek to support you and kind of what we're learning from other contexts. As Sarah mentioned, I'll spend a bit of time now. This first piece of this, dual question of how do we both steward return to the workforce state employees while at the same time focusing on the reimagination. So I'll spend the next 10 minutes focused on that first part. When we think about the blueprint for managing that return to work to ensure that employees both safeguards in place and have the clarity they need to continue to do the work, really think of it in three major components. The first is how we better understand our state workforce and the services that we're providing in a pretty nuanced way beyond kind of what might be captured in existing continuity plans to understand truly what are those employees that can continue to work from home, what different enablements may they need, what services may need to be delivered in a different way. And so kind of I'll talk through a process of how do we truly begin to segment services employees for managing the return. And I see some breakup, so let me try to fix that. Second, how do we better understand the workplace environment and what are safeguards that we need to enact to really make sure that the workplaces are safe as employees begin to come back. As Sarah referenced, we know there's a wide variety of workspaces. There are some kind of traditional office environments, other state work sites that are more akin to retail environments such as your DMV, and then truly kind of special purpose works, be them, professional facilities or schools, right, that have to be thought very differently. Each of those different archetypes of workspaces require a very different type of set of infrastructure and safeguard requirements. And so we'll talk the framework of how to consider those different pieces and how you can support state workforces and different agencies in putting those safeguards in place. And then lastly, we'll also be speaking a bit around what is the governance that you really want to ensure is set up, because managing this return will require coordination across silos that, you know, is quite unprecedented. So how do you think about the various types of work streams? And we'll highlight a few that we think are really important to stand up, and the kind of interdisciplinary nature of those and the types of stakeholders that you might want at the table to support each of these critical work areas as you move forward. So why don't we spend a bit of time talking about that first section. So we think about the critical questions and start to segment the services that the state is collectively responsible for across agencies and employees, and you know, where they may be able to work. We think about those that are most critical. What are the job functions and types that are required to be in person? Those can be done remotely. How do we think about things that can be automated? What type of flexibility do states have in you know, setting up different employee work environments? So those are some of the questions that are percolating as we begin to tackle this question. So as we roll forward, this will probably feel familiar to each of you as we kind of, this is meant to be illustrative as we took a look at typical states as informed by one area where we've gone a little bit deeper in. As we look at the range of state government employees across different service operations, what we see is that right now, while everyone is typically online, there's a different way in which, you know, there are very few services that have been fully halted, but there's a range of those that are operating some kind of limited environment, remote environment, fully remote. Some that obviously for essential are continue to be operational in person, and some other setups. And so the challenge that we have is taking a baseline that is quite diverse and managing a return back, knowing that the return will be different for different agencies and different types of operations. So before we move forward, we thought to actually pause here to get your opinion in a poll, and just do this with the chat function, so a little bit more informal. But as you think about the different state services that you see unfolding, those that have been paused or maybe adjusted, what are those that you view as the most pressing to resume?
Would love for everybody's input. I heard a great comment from another state that said, you know, sure, we could treat until now like one extended snow day, but at some point we have to get things started again.
Motor vehicle, yeah. Other perspectives? Fleet inspections related to public health, courts is one that's come up quite a bit. DMV, driving, motor vehicle, driver licensing, yes. Great. So a range of services seems to be a bit of clustering around DMV driver services, part of the criminal justice system, courts, inspections, and as you can see, kind of each of those is kind of a very different environment, right? So as we start to think about how we begin to resume services, we're going to have to think across each of those archetypes as we move to the return. So thanks. Free to continue sharing your thoughts. I'll roll forward just in the interest of time, and then we can kind of continue to consider this an open discussion. So I'm going to talk about this for a moment. We think about categorizing those range of services which we're continuing to discuss in the chat function. We really think across two axes. So which are those services that, as they're operational, have implications for the risk of virus spread because of how high contact they are? And then genuinely, which are the urgency to reopen because of the types of priorities that you're trying to advance? So this type of framing, taking the set of services that we referenced on our page and thinking about this kind of framing could help inform your game plan as you think about those priority services in the first sequence versus second wave versus the third on how you begin to manage that return. So hopefully that's a helpful way to begin to step into this. When we get a little bit more granular into thinking about state workforce itself, if we just push forward. Yeah, thank you. We really think about the workforce in 4 categories. The first 3 of which is, how you could actually start to really capture some data on your state workforce. Those that are actually site critical, where they have to, actually be on site, potentially in a kind of a different work environment, but need to be in person. Those that are site flexible, where there's some planning to be done of how do we actually stage the return, think about the context of the work. And those that are, could be fully virtual, may require some different tech enablements, but can continue to work virtually. And then, of course, alongside those 3, there's a set of roles that will be fundamentally reimagined because there's new responsibilities that are necessary in light of this crisis, new roles, areas that are surging where you need to think about fundamentally different roles. And so over the next couple pages, what I'll show is just one example of, from one state that began to send a set of surveys out to catalog how they actually think about their state workforce. So this is an illustrative example with, 100,000 state employees, of those that are actually site critical versus fully virtually enabled versus site flexible. What I'll just share from experience with, a few of the states I'm sure represented on the call here is there's actually a greater degree of those that are actually virtually enabled than you might anticipate. And so it really helps to sort of bound the challenge of in the very near term as we're sorting the return, who are those that are actually site critical that we need to think of as our quote unquote first wave, while we continue to put in place some of the supports to allow those that are either site flexible or virtually enabled continue to operate at a kind of high productive capacity. And that might just require some, small tech enablements to allow them to continue to do so. The challenge here, right, is really how do you get people back in as sequenced a way as possible so that you're not overwhelming the system kind of right out of the gate. I'll just briefly show kind of the next 2 slides as kind of a continuation of that example. When you think about those that are site critical versus site flexible versus virtually enabled, you'll see a very different mix across different departments. So again, in just helping you kind of align on how do you sequence the return, where do you zero in on the pieces that are most important, you'll get a sense of both criticality of the workforce writ large across the state, but what are those departments that really have the greatest bulk of site critical employees that might want to be thought of as part of your first wave, and you start to kind of create a SWAT team with those departmental leaders to manage the return. And then if we push forward, this was kind of another quite interesting learning is if you look at those that are able to work remotely, that are virtually enabled, but may need some additional tech enablement or some other enablement, which may not be technology, but actually support, as Sarah mentioned, many of your state workforce employees are dealing with the same challenges that we all are, caring for elderly family members, trying to sort out childcare. And so getting a better understanding of what are those enablements that folks need to continue to be working from home in a safer environment, is critical to ascertain, because it allows you then to have that data to put some of those supports in place. Okay, so just to move on to the next section, as I talked about, the second part of this challenge is how do you actually assess those workplaces that state employees will be returning to, and what are the safeguards that you want to put in place with government operated facilities and buildings, knowing that, there's some buildings where you're a co-tenant with other tenants as well, some that you fully manage and own, and each of those have different entry points. And so, this requires a different set of thinking and safeguards across those different archetypes. So on the next page, I'll just share a few of what those archetypes are along 2 axes. Those types of work environments that have either kind of low public contact versus high, and those where you have kind of more control over the environment. So we've cataloged 5 archetypes that we think are really important to solve for, have different implications for the type of safeguards that you need to put in place. I won't go through them in full detail for the purposes of time here, but as mentioned, we'll be sending this out, and I'd encourage you to kind of think about your state office spaces and work environments across these different axes And then, with some of the subsequent pages of what are the safeguards that are necessary for each of those, because obviously a public transportation context is very different than a call center, which is very different, than a postal office or a DMV. So I'll just show one example on the next slide. We really think about safeguarding measures across 6 different domains. So the first is, what are the workforce protections that you actually need? So think about the entry to work sites. As Sarah mentioned, we'll have to imagine, completely different ways of accessing buildings may involve temperature checks, screening questions, different ways for folks to get to work. Employee protection, so actually PPE requirements. How are folks both estimating their PPE needs, working with central purchasing, independent agency purchasing on how they're procuring those. Non-employee protections, so we know especially those retail environments like DMVs that, customers are walking in, how do we implement kind of physical distancing measures, have the appropriate signage, limit exposure. Business process adaptations. All these changes mean that operations are going to look very different. They're going to have implications on productivity if there's limited number of people allowed in a particular work site or folks working from home. So what are those business process adaptations that need to be made? What are the employer-led public health measures? So in some cases, the state as the employer may be supporting some of the operations around detection and tracing where cases emerge. And then how do you align with some of the industry-wide safeguards that are put in place and adhering to different counties across the state that have different protocols that may be coming online at different times? And so those are the different themes that we think are really important to solve for as you're looking at each of these work sites. On the next page, I'll just share one example. I won't go through this in detail. But for each of these types of work sites, this is kind of the archetype I shared of office workers, getting very clear on, okay, what are all the considerations we need to have in place in terms of travel and movement to work, entry to the work site, health policy measures. And I won't go through kind of the rest of the ones here just for the interest of time, but we've shared some of those considerations for your benefit so you can think about each of your work sites and the considerations you may want to set in place. So just to close this section, we understand that alongside kind of the actual operational challenge, this is also just a change management challenge, right? Many of the employees are dealing with the same points of anxiety that we all are, trying to adapt to this new way of working. So the question really is here, how do you get employees back to work quickly? How do you continue to maintain a great employee experience? And how do you sustain this journey for the long run and make a down payment on some of those points of reimagination that Sarah referenced, that you want to use this as an opportunity to advance? I will just close this section on how you manage the return to work by just saying a few words about governance. As you're stewarding that safe return, segmenting services, segmenting employees, thinking about workplace safeguards, the question here is, there's a fundamentally new governance imperative, right? Everyone from facilities to operations to finance is having to work together to manage this problem that is changing daily. And so how do you set up sort of an agile governance structure to manage this overall return? One construct that you'll see on the next page that we've seen be set up, and I'm sure each of your states already has some version of this, is a nerve center or kind of unified command that is to manage each of these work streams. We think this is really critical to have a work group around kind of how you're actually segmenting, prioritizing state services, how you're actually caring for those workplace safeguards, how you're planning the return and reimagining the new normal in a way that's agile and allows for real-time learning, but has clear lines of accountability. So setting up this nerve center is quite critical, and would be happy as we kind of get into the discussion portion of today's session to hear how each of you have been managing that piece of this challenge. And then the last point on the next page is supporting that team and that governance structure that's put in place is, how do you support it with real-time decision intelligence? This is just one example of how we thought about it, of the different kind of components around foundational public health, societal compliance, system capacity, safeguarding, protection for vulnerable communities, economic health, the epidemiological reality on the ground. Do you have kind of an ongoing dashboard that allows you to monitor the latest statistics, data, leading indicators across each of these domains, so that decisions that are made real time are supported by the best evidence on the ground at the moment. Before I pass back to Sarah, I'll just close with this last point, which is, a few principles of managing this that are really important are the communications for state employees. So I'm sure this is consistent with how you all are each thinking about it, but the reality is we don't have all the answers, and yet we have the challenge of communicating to large workforces around what we know, when we know it, and kind of what some of the implications are. So some of the principles that we found to be helpful, both in this environment, but as we've been working with some of our private sector clients as well, is just being visible and transparent as you're communicating kind of what we know, focusing on the public health, the facts and the reality on the ground, keeping messages really short and simple, and really anticipating what some of those follow-ups may be and having mechanisms in place to address those, be they through kind of, calling or digital channels. And then I'll just close on kind of this point 5, which is just acknowledging the emotions and the uncertainty of the moment, leading with empathy. This is something that has come up time and time again with folks across sectors, is that they're trying to both manage this return, but also care for their employees who are, dealing with not only their own personal challenges in managing the return, but sort of the stress that comes with kind of the underlying situation across the board. So with that, Sarah, we'll go ahead and skip this one, but turn it back to Sarah to talk through the reimagination imperative.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, this is great. And so thank you so much for everything you shared there. I think, to me, in conversations with a handful of other state leaders, a couple of the things from Kunal's portion, I think, that had really popped for them was this idea that you may not bring folks back by seniority or by whole team, which actually then may mean something very different for what your short-term organizational structure looks like. And so rather than imagining, I can bring 10% back and then another 10%, or I can bring this whole unit back and then this next unit, actually planning for some of that complexity of what is site critical work, and that may be very different person to person, was sort of an aha, and helped it to kind of do some of that different planning and adds a layer of complexity, but then also really, if anything, make sure you're getting the most productivity and the most folks back who really, really need to be there. And then probably also on this point about the communications, that there is continued uncertainty. And so as each of you are thinking through planning for contingencies and also being able to communicate what you do know versus what is open, we have much more we could share there with you that we've seen from the private sector on this point, and especially from around the world where places are a little bit ahead of us in having managed some of this. So let us know in the chat and otherwise what is helpful, and we can take this in several other directions. Here, at least, I would like to just introduce, and then Meg is going to share, I think, a few examples that I hope will be exciting around the reimagination. And so this list of questions are things that we have heard from many of you and have heard across the country, which is, we've learned a lot about technology in this moment. Not that we didn't know already, but we've really seen and been pushed in ways that we might not have expected. And so how do we think about then new tools that could help us be more resilient going forward? What also have we learned now that we do want to carry with us? And so how do we take the time amid the crisis moment to capture some of that so that we don't lose the things that our employees actually would ask us to keep? And so that type of two-way dialogue and making sure you hear from your teams what they would at least like to be on the table to consider for the future may be very important. And then finally, is there actually is there something here about talent that could help you rethink your talent model, where folks have been quite excited actually about the potential for more remote or more digital to be able to open up different ways of working and with different types of employees perhaps, or spread in different locations in ways you may not have done before. So that type of talent planning and thinking for going forward may also be something of interest. Great. So here as we think about what has changed, much has been said about the, what will be permanent, and are we going to see broad onshoring and, supply chains becoming more localized? There are all these big questions, right? There's a lot that we don't know, but at least here from what we have seen and what we have seen that is different and that we do believe will carry forward is that employee expectations have already reset in a lot of ways. Flexible work locations, remote work, different work hours, the realization also of how critical childcare and family care responsibilities are, and perhaps among your team having had more open conversations about those constraints and caring and just what that means for people that they may not have brought to work before this moment. That is likely different and is likely to carry through. We also would suspect from the public the changes that have been made for emergency purposes, folks may now be re-baselined in their expectations. So a desire to see more digital, a desire to see the ability to engage more remotely, perhaps some fear of engaging in person going forward for some period of time. Of course, we don't know, but that may be a present reality. And that we are seeing this from survey work we have done across demographics. So this is not it's not a generational thing. The talk of always, are we sure that everyone is wanting to engage in a remote way? We're actually seeing this across the board. That may be call centers still. It's not to say that it's all, mobile enhanced based, but we are seeing the desire for these remote channels. And then finally, administrative expectations. And I think this may be weighing heavily on each of you. You have been pushing through to do more with less. If that is a team who has stood down, or if you have each lost, several hours of the day that you used to have because you had X, Y, and Z supports in your life, and now all those things are gone. Is that expectation of doing more with less something that will carry through? And especially going into a tough budget year, how do we think about that? And if anything, I would say the one positive that we have heard from many of you is that the cross training and flexibility that many states have put in to say, I have this team of employees who are site critical, but I can't justify bringing them in and creating risk for them. So I'm going to stand their work down. I'm going to cross train them on X other activity that can be done virtually. We've seen that in a lot of places, if that's spinning up to support unemployment backlogs or other services. And so is there a continued expectation actually of cross training and of flexibility that might help you think about talent at the state level as more of a shared pool? That to me is very exciting. Let's see if that continues. But we offer these as food for thought. And now Meg is going to talk to us about a couple examples here that I think you'll be excited to see.
Great. So, I think as Sarah talked about changing expectations, but also, why consider reimagination? Why consider change during a crisis? So I'll go through these pretty quickly, but by necessity, we know that the scale, the pace of innovation has increased so much. So organizations now know what they can do, and often have figured out, again, by necessity, improvements to the way that they may operate. And not only that, it's become pretty clear, the value of services and functions, what needs to be pared down, what potentially could we double down on. And when it comes to actually making those changes, the environment, the willingness to accept change, both in an organizational and at a personal level, is extremely high. I mean, for the world was turned upside down. So everyone's operating in a very different way and willing to consider long-term changes moving forward. So definitely taking advantage of that willingness and that ability. And then finally, something that we've already touched on, which is, understanding that fiscal year 2020 budgets are likely to be more robust than in coming years, and really using that to set ourselves up for years in the future to figure out how to be more cost efficient, how to be more effective, how to do these things in a way that's really going to help us set up for success in coming years. And so what we can do now is think about an example that we have, and we can move to the next slide. We can think about an example that we have, taking a customer experience lens and looking actually at DMV and driver services. So, I know that a lot of folks mentioned that DMV services were particularly critical to get back. And so first of all, when we talk about a customer experience lens, what we're saying here is, how do we take the perspectives of customers, of employees, of basically all of the folks who are really engaging deeply with these services, and think about their needs, their desires, their pain points, figure out, what exactly those are, and incorporate them. And then also really think through, we're not just trying to get folks back to these services safely, but it's a balance between safety and humanity. So it's eliminating risk, but also really thinking about the human experience. And I think we have all experienced it ourselves with face masks, which are it's an intervention to keep folks safe, but it makes it very difficult to make eye contact now. And so how do you do things in a way which is you still need masks, but it's thinking through how do you incorporate other ways in which to really have that human experience, to really take into account the experience that people have, think through physical safety as well as psychological safety. And so what we have here is we've looked at the Real ID journey at the DMV, and what we've done is, sorry, we can go back. Thank you. And we've looked at the Real ID journey, and we've looked at the primary steps in the journey, identified what those are, and then thinking through what those risks are. So giving them a score, you can based on exposure, frequency, and duration. And then once you identify those, what you can do is think about solutions. So if we go to the next slide, we can think about developing solutions that will both keep people safe, but also improve services for them. And it's not just coming up with physical interventions, but really thinking through how can processes be different? What policies need to be changed? What can we digitize? What services, are there new services that we needed to offer before that we couldn't, and now the opportunity to offer them exists? And really, this is not just keeping people safe. It's not just improving service experience, but it's also how do you get back to delivering service, but doing it in a way that's more efficient, doing it in a way that's more cost effective, doing it in a way that capitalizes on trends that are already coming through. I mean, we know from the NASCA and McKinsey survey that folks were already saying the digitization automation was a priority for them, but now it's more important than ever. So how do we incorporate that into our thinking and really reimagine when we think about services, how to keep people safe physically and psychologically, but also how to set ourselves up for the future to really deliver service more efficiently and effectively.
Wonderful. Meg, thank you so much. And here, this is really getting to the end of our discussion, and we just had a little bit more we wanted to share. I also appreciated the question in the chat about performance metrics, which I can speak to quickly before moving into the broader reimagination point. And that is to say that we actually have seen pretty consistently in the private sector that in this moment, to try to reduce stress, many leading companies have actually changed their performance process to lighten the load, whether that is in the intensity of effort or in trying to be clear. Meeting expectations is actually quite good right now, given everything that others are dealing with at home, and that long-term performance is much more tied to reducing stress and helping people manage this moment and getting the best of folks that we can, rather than having an additional overlay of performance at this point. There was actually a pretty interesting article that was from Sheryl Sandberg that spoke to this point, and Facebook is one prominent example of who has been doing this. And that was about the choice of investing in the future and actually paying everyone performance pay as if they had all been at a meets expectations standard. So an interesting option. I also know that from having been a government employee myself at the city level and the federal level, I know that performance pay might not be something that you are thinking or talking about. So I don't mean to say that without empathy, but just at least in that spirit of seeing this trend for, reducing stress in this time. And so I think that is it's an interesting question though, of how do you measure productivity in this moment, and how do you think about rewarding and celebrating folks who have really gone above and beyond, and really being able to show that support and gratitude for what many people have done in very, very trying times. So you have seen some states who have thought about the where possible to do some kind of performance-based pay for the moments, especially for people who have been in site critical occupations and have been putting themselves and their health at risk. So we can talk more about that, but I've actually seen far less, at least, of performance as a way to think about who comes back first. But that is part of the longer term, actually, reimagination thinking we have heard, which is to say, if you have not seen a productivity drop, perhaps in an area where you either had to turn off the service or you had to reduce the focus on a service, or if you had to stand down some part of a team or pivot part of a team to support another agency, if you now saw actually less of an effect than you might have thought from that, or if you have, in the alternative, if you have seen a real need that you surged to meet, that type of planning has informed very much who comes back. So making sure that you have some time to do that thinking before you bring people back to work sites so that you don't then make changes after folks have come back. But if you are trying to do any reassignments, or if you are in the unfortunate position of needing to think about how big can my workforce be, what can I really sustain going forward, that you do that thinking before you bring folks back to try to reduce the level of disruption that's happening all at once. So I hope that's helpful a bit. I also saw the slide deck question. We are, of course, happy to provide this. We also have an article that may be helpful that you could share broadly with others, and would love to continue the conversation. So here, I think just very briefly to close this out would be thinking about reimagining. Do you have leadership support in your team? Are you using customer research? Even if your customer is your coworker, if you are serving another agency or if you're providing a critical service to another part of government, are you using tools like survey methodologies, ethnographic research, doing design sessions to walk in their shoes, using that type of what is the journey of someone else's experience of interacting with me to solve for this long-term resilience? Also, think about the backlog, and think about the backlog in context of your strategy. So I think this speaks actually some to the performance point. Really use the moment of what you have learned and what you have observed about how your effectiveness has changed to inform your go-forward strategy. I think a small example there has really been on real estate footprint. We know from our conversations with many of you over the last several years, thinking about facility savings, and especially in particularly high-cost locations, had already been a priority. So ideally using this moment to overlay that site critical, site flexible mapping that Kunal had showed, overlay that with your facilities footprint and think about where there might be really high cost locations that are actually not necessary for getting the work done. So this gives you a moment to say, do I actually need that space or do I need far less of it? Getting dedicated resources where you can. I think the idea of a reimagined team, we have seen in the crisis, the best creativity from our experience, and for me, I worked in city government post-Katrina, actually in New Orleans, and so have seen this there too. Very important to segregate a team that is focused on crisis with a team who is able to actually do the longer term thinking, because otherwise the longer term will just absolutely never get the attention. So can you create even a very small team who really is thinking past the return to work period to help you with this and help you with this strategy, and giving them the space to be able to do that if you can make that happen. Using data here where you can, surveying your fellow team members at least as a starting point to understand productivity, and to also monitor as folks do come back to the office to be able to see and learn more over that time and keep that information. And then finally, iteration, being comfortable here given the uncertainty, as we've talked about, that we are very much going to need to be in a test and learn mode for quite some time. And so how do we do after action reviews? If you bring one team back, how do we then learn? How do we also learn from who has been on site through this whole crisis and really learn what worked for them and be able to carry that forward? Great. So here we go on our last question.
Thank you. And Christy is going to be launching that poll. And while she's getting all of that up, Sometimes it takes a second to get all that launched and ready. All right, so let's see if I can do it. If we'll see if I can do it, looks like she's having some technical difficulties to launch that. If you'll see if there's any questions from the audience. I know we're about 5 minutes left.
Yes, that's great. I see one here on the productivity piece. This has been a comment we have heard quite a lot, and I do not have cross-state data about productivity, but we do hear consistently that remote work in the spirit of productivity, and actually the number of employees who have asked to carry forward remote work into the future, despite the challenges of this last period of time. I think that's been quite shocking. That's been true for McKinsey, for ourselves actually as well. And so I very much hear your question, and I think I imagine that will resonate with others here. And so, yes, would love to hear your perspectives on this poll question. So what is the highest priority for you as you think about reimagination?
And it looks like we have several of those responses coming in. We're at about 20%, and so that poll should be in front of you for those who are seeing it. So thank you guys so much for responding to those. And I just want to do a check. Was Nelson from Maryland on the phone? I know. All right. I just wanted to check if we have him there. All right. So it looks like we have a really good response. You ready for me to end that poll and go ahead and launch to show the results?
Great. Wonderful. I mean, I think seeing the connection of data and to mission is quite telling. And for each of you, I would imagine what those data sources are that are most important is likely to be different. But if that hits on some of the themes that other folks have asked and questions too about productivity, performance, how people are feeling, I would imagine that's quite a bit of it, and then is going to be unique for each of your domains as well. And we would love to share more from what we showed, just that brief dashboard example earlier of what some states are using to think about this planning.
Thank you. And I think we have everyone on mute. So if you want to kind of give your reflections on this poll questions, if you'll write in the chat, and then Christy will unmute you so that you can ask that question. And so I'm also going to make sure Nelson wasn't one of these phone lines. Nelson, are you on the line? All right. We'll go ahead and mute those phone lines again. Is there anyone that wants to share with the group that's on the line? You're all muted now, so we just need to know to unmute you if anyone wants to share their perspective.
I think, Pam, you might want to unmute.
We'll try this one more time. How's that? I was saying that I had noticed Janelle had made several comments from Illinois. I didn't know, Janelle, if you wanted to share any thoughts while we have the McKinsey team with us.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I guess comment/question. When you guys were talking through the points about productivity and the private sector, I was just interested in understanding if you were getting similar feedback around, like, we don't pay for performance here. It would be great if we could, but we don't. If that feedback was consistent for the public sector, because I think my observations have been some people have stepped up mightily, and in more cases than I would have expected. And so I've been more than pleasantly surprised. I think other people have been a lot more interested in learning how to adapt to the new normal, right? So that's category 2. So doing good work will get better, right? So they're going from good to great, or even if not good to great, good to better. And then there is a segment where they're still doing, and every employer has this, they're doing the bare minimum, if that. And so I was just wondering, and again, I know that that population still exists in the private sector, how the conversations around pay for performance, especially now, especially when managers are stretched even more thin to be strategic and to pivot and to iterate and to manage remotely in ways they haven't before, how that might crosswalk to government, where traditionally we've hired different types of employees. We have not permitted remote work. We manage a lot of times with employees being butt in seat. And anyway, I'll stop there and I'll turn it to you guys to see if you have some ideas on that or thoughts on that.
It's a great question, and I can start and would love for Kunal to chime in. I think what I have heard from my state clients in particular is that it does make clear the need for a way to measure productivity. You know, in thinking about data, that's been the big question, is actually what is that? Because we used to think about it, you know, at least I could say, I know somebody is here and therefore I know they're doing something. And of course, you could imagine trying to translate that to a virtual world as at least a minimum, perhaps, but I think it has created this desire to say, how do I understand what I'm hoping my team will do? And how do I get then cascading perspectives on priorities and performance in a way that that's not measured just by time and attendance in a lot of ways? And that's a big question, but I think has been both sort of scary of thinking about how to set that up and how to do that and how to cascade that fully, but has pushed to be a connection to strategy, to say, here's a chance to think through what am I hoping every individual is able to do and contribute to the broader mission.
Thank you.
Great.
Apologies, that was on me. One thing that I would add is, you know, as I talk through kind of different ways of segmenting services and employees, and understanding kind of who's site critical, who can work from home, who may need additional enablements, be there in technology or otherwise, that is an important overlay to the productivity question as well. So using that as basis and you know, using a mix of kind of crude measures of productivity, which is like real-time polling of frontline managers who can, you know, give perceptions on an individual level, but at a work group level, and then layering it on top of, you know, those who may be remote or need some other enablement, can help you at least get some directional guidance in the very near term of where those pockets of either super productivity or challenges around productivity, and is it really something underlying from an adjustment perspective, or is it actually about the type of work that they're doing and the enablements that they require? So I would you know, encourage that. I think part of those upfront pieces we're talking about can be a useful set of data to collect in order to, you know, get some more around the productivity question in particular.
Wonderful.
I'm conscious that we've gone.
Go ahead, Kunal.
I was just saying I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I'll turn to you and Jamie to guide us.
Thank you very, very much. We appreciate everyone being on the call today. We are a few minutes past 3. We do want to be respectful of everything else that's on your calendar. So thank you again for joining us today. I want to thank Sarah, Kunal, and Meg for presenting to us today. And again, thank you so much to McKinsey & Company for supporting our event today. Make sure to check out NASCA's website, nasca.org. You'll find these materials up soon, but there's just an entire wealth of information around the pandemic and state responses, federal responses, as well as input and tools from our corporate partners. So again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you can join us for another event in the future very, very soon.